In this episode, we talk about the protests in Arunachal Pradesh over the pivotal Upper Siang hydropower project. We also talk about the arrest and rustication of a Pune student over a social media post on Operation Sindoor. But first, we talk about Apple's plans to step up the production of iPhones in India. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Earlier this month, Apple CEO Tim Cook confirmed that because of the trade uncertainties related to China, the company would produce the majority of iPhones sold in the US in India during the June quarter. The statement was significant, especially since China has long been the central hub of Apple's manufacturing operations. However, the announcement received a strong pushback from US President Donald Trump, who made it clear that he did not want Apple to do that.
I had a little problem with Tim Cook yesterday. I said to him, Tim, you're my friend. I've treated you very good. You're coming in with $500 billion, but now I hear you're building all over India. I don't want you building in India. You can build in India if you want to take care of India. I said, Tim, look, we've treated you really good. We put up with all the plants that you built in China for years. Now you got to build us. We're not interested in you building in India. India can take care of themselves. They're doing very well. We want you to build here, and they're going to...
Now, just a couple of days after Trump's response, Apple's key manufacturer Foxconn announced that it is moving forward with a $1.5 billion display module plant in India. This move also drew another round of criticism from Trump, who warned that Apple would face a 25% tariff if it sold iPhones in the US that were built in India or anywhere else. To understand the reasons behind this pushback and what Apple choosing to manufacture in India means for the country, my colleague Shashank Bhargava spoke to the Indian Express's Soumyarendra Barik.
Soumyarendra, things have shifted a bit since Cook first spoke about, producing the majority of iPhones sold in the US in India. But talk about what prompted him to consider this move.
So, of course, starting April 2nd, we know the assault on the global trade ecosystem that Trump sought to bring about, introducing tariffs on pretty much every single country. Of course, there was a disparity. Some countries were being taxed much higher than the others. But of course, in the beginning days, since April 2nd, it was very clear that his prime target was going to be China, because China was, of course, taxed much higher. So in the initial days, it seemed that it was going to be a bit messy between the US and China. And for any country which has exposure to both the countries, particularly like Apple, they were going to be caught in the crosshairs of, that escalation. So when Apple was on its latest earnings call, it told analysts and its investors that it was planning, at least for the June quarter in the near term, to kind of only sell India-made or sell primarily India-made iPhones in the US as a way to skirt some of those Chinese-related tariffs that the US had imposed on them.
And has this been one of the main objectives of his tariff regime, to bring a lot of these manufacturing jobs back to the US?
Absolutely. One of his main aspirations with the entire tariff thing, or at least one of his stated objectives with the entire tariff regime that he's trying to bring about, is that he wants to see some sort of manufacturing come back to the US, of course, which has, over the years, over decades, manufacturing has moved away from the US as the country has grown economically, because there were cheaper alternatives initially out there, China, the key among them. But of course, also, countries like China, over the years, they've equipped themselves, they've equipped their population, they're all very well educated, they're very well trained, skilled professionals, skilled engineers, etc. A lot of cutting work now happening domestically within countries like China, also to an extent in India, etc. Even these countries' reliance on American technology, for instance, has sort of reduced, and particularly, most starkly in the case of China, where on many fronts, it is very self-reliant at this point in time. Using a lot of domestically made technologies. So yeah, with Trump's announcement about the tariffs, his broad hope that the manufacturing, at least in the tech sector, would move to the US.
And could you give a sense of how beneficial Apple and its manufacturing related work has been for China? Because in that sense, India has also been trying to court Apple, right? And over time, Apple has begun production here as well, and the government has really pushed for that.
Now, like you discussed, Apple has outsourced almost all of its manufacturing to Asia, to countries like China, India, and Vietnam. For China, Apple assembly has been a big growth driver, as it is not just, of course, Apple is making there, Foxconn's making there, but, it's also spurred a supply chain centralization in the country, which is also benefiting its other domestic industries. Now, India, as a second fiddle, has also managed to attract Apple as its second assembly base, with the company wanting to diversify its operations. And as of this point, roughly it accounts for about 15% of all the iPhones that are made globally. Of course, in China, the number is far, far more. Now, there are a few fundamental problems with Trump's hope, and the fact that he's choosing to ignore the realities of essentially how supply chains form and work. It's a years-long process. If Apple's making phones in China right now, it's because, years and years of work has gone into forming, very formidable supply chains which can withstand, these geopolitical hits or, whatever acts of nature, etc. And at least in the near term or, on the horizon of say like a year or two or even 3 or 4 years, even to that much time period, no amount of tariff threats, that's what experts believe, can cause, these supply chains to migrate to new geographies, specifically geographies which do not have a historic supply base already available.
Right, it takes billions of dollars to set up those supply chains. For example, in China, years and years have gone by to set up those plants, set up entire towns essentially, and people there are now skilled to do very, very specific tasks which a company like Apple would require. And all that can't really happen overnight in a country like the US.
Absolutely. Tim Cook was once asked in one of his interviews about why Apple chose to produce in China. And, because at that point in time, the notion or the largely held belief was that, Apple is making China just because it's cheap, because, labor's cheap there. And Tim Cook, I think, rightly said that, China stopped being a low labor cost market many, many decades ago. And in fact, what China really has to offer is the per capita availability of skilled professionals. He said that, for something like, say, something which are tooling engineers, I think that's the example that he'd used in his statement at that point in time. He said that if in the US I have a meeting of 2 skilled tooling engineers, he could barely fill a room. But if he did the same meeting in China, he'd be able to fill multiple football fields. So that just goes on to show, how in-depth Chinese people have gone into developing these skills within the population, and how well they have managed to, kind of not only work towards developing that particular skill for a particular job, but also to kind of diversify themselves into making more domestic technologies in other sectors, kind of learning from one sector and kind of applying that same logic to other sectors as well. I think that's what China has done really, really well. And, even for in India, for a US, it's very difficult to match up to that. And then, of course, China and the Chinese government is, of course, very well aware of this leverage that they have over the global supply chain. And I think that's why we saw the escalation, because potentially it was only going to be China who could withstand, what many have called US tariff bullying, essentially, to withstand that, and not just to withstand, but also respond in a similar fashion on the US, which, and, many would say that that is what finally forced the US hand into kind of signing this trade deal with China, but given that the initial impression was that US tariff action is primarily targeted at China.
Right, so in that sense, China still remains a crucial country for Apple. But where do you think India stands at the moment? To what extent have we been able to ramp up our manufacturing capabilities?
India is at an interesting point at this point in time, given that, of course, the growth in assembling of smartphones has been very rapid thanks to the production-linked incentive schemes that began in 2020. And of course, Apple has been the primary driver of that entire scheme. It's producing the most amount of smartphones. It's also cornering the most amount of subsidies that are available under the scheme. But also, of course, India has its own limitations, given its workforce, the skill level in the workforce, etc. And just also the concentration of the workforce. There is a reason why at this point in time, a majority of its operations are centered around states which are seen as, more well-educated, comparatively more progressive, states like Tamil Nadu, states like Karnataka, etc. Also because, historically, these are states where women participation in the workforce has traditionally been higher than, say, the northern part of the country, etc. And also given that assembling operations, do have a lot of intake of women workers as well. And I think because there were enough number of women who had the access to come to a workplace away from their homes to work in assembly plants, I think that could have only happened in places like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka as a first step. I'm sure things will get better for other regions as well. But because that was immediately available, those states took the lead, and at this point in time, they are taking the charge basically for most of the assembly operations that are happening in the country. But of course, India is of course not uniform that way. Many states would be a lot behind Tamil Nadu and Karnataka on educational metrics, on women's participation in the workforce, etc. And certainly much, much, much behind China at this point in time. Of course, we are on the right path. We've taken the right initiatives. We've taken the right directions at this point in time. But of course, China has just a lead, which at this point in time is really insurmountable for India. It'll take a lot of years. So yeah, if you talk to government officials here, that's the sense. If there is a potential thaw in the US and China relationship dynamic, it will come at a cost of India, because China already has this technological advantage over India. So any trade deal that ever so slightly benefits India is actually a net negative for India, because even if China is a little worse off in any trade deal with the US than an Indian deal with the US, China would still have the lead, right? So China's deal would have to be like really to a degree worse than what India's trade deal with the US is for India to kind of still have that advantage over China. And of course, the government here is very cognizant of that, which is why even we are putting forth our best foot in our own negotiations with the US to strike a great deal. Of course, there are some problems going on there as well. But yeah, a lot hinges on how India's trade deal with the US looks like. And, when we get to see the final fine print of the trade deal between US and China.
And when we talk about India investing in manufacturing, how important would you say it considers this sector? How important is it for India to get companies like Apple to manufacture its products here?
So if you look at the manufacturing value chain, for instance, right? And let's understand it from the example of an iPhone itself, right? When I have an iPhone in hand, what has it taken for that phone to reach my hand, for instance, right? There is a company like Foxconn, which has all the thousands and thousands of parts which go into making this phone on its assembly line with all its workers lined up. They all have all those individual parts with every person, kind of picking and placing and pasting one part on top of the other until it reaches the final person where the phone looks like what it looks like to us when we finally end up buying it, right? But in the middle, what's happened? Of course, there is a person or there are companies who have made those individual small bits and pieces. There are companies which have made batteries. There is a company which has made the display, the phone display. There is a company which has made the outer aluminum case. And it's a very diversified process essentially. And also, if you look at this entire value chain and take an assembly operation, for instance, where one person is picking a chip and putting it, the other person is picking up a battery pack and putting it in the phone, etc. It also all creates, good quality jobs, jobs which would pay you say like 20,000, 25,000, 30,000 rupees a month. And that's of course great money for the kind of people who get involved in these economies, right? So from India's perspective, assembling phones was like the first target it had because it was also relatively the easier thing to do in that entire value chain, because making a display, making a battery pack, or making a chip, for instance, those are much more difficult processes than, when you have all these final products and you just have to assemble them. That's a much easier step than the steps that come before that. It was a largely low-hanging fruit, so India targeted that. It gave incentives, or it announced incentives through its production-linked incentive, the PLI scheme for smartphones. So I think manufacturing, and specifically smartphone manufacturing, has been a very important project for India. It's also probably the most successful PLI scheme at this point in time. It has created incremental investment for more than, I think, 1 lakh people over the last 3 years. Of course, it has also ended India's reliance on importing smartphones, because now I think India is very self-sufficient. It produces all the smartphones domestically that it consumes. And this has happened all very rapidly in the span of the last 4 or 5 years only, from virtually a non-existent assembly base in the country. So to that extent, the PLI scheme has been, of course, very, very helpful in creating jobs and creating some kind of manufacturing operations in the country. And also, when you get a marquee name like Apple associated with the project, the world does take notice. So to that extent, the government wants to keep Apple happy. The government wants Apple to expand in India, because if Apple expands in India, there is a larger hope that more suppliers will come in, more companies will come in, more jobs will get created, more skill development will happen within people in the country. And I think it's a net positive for the country. Although having said that, manufacturing's contribution to net GDP hasn't really grown, despite us becoming almost self-reliant in domestic smartphone production. So that is also something to take note, that most sectors aren't really kicking in the way. But certainly the smartphone sector has been something which has been more or less a success for the Make in India narrative.
And we are talking about this now, but like you mentioned, Apple began shifting some of its manufacturing to India a few years ago, right? Could you talk about what had prompted that, and to what extent can China-like supply chains be set up here?
So one has to be cognizant of this fact, right? Apple did not start doubling down on India in response to Trump's tariffs. Apple's gradual move towards India began much before. It began in 2020, and that was primarily led because of the COVID-led restrictions that came in place in China when the country went on a near complete shutdown, right? And that's when Apple had realized that any unforeseen event that impacts production in China to that substantial level is a big kind of a business threat to them, which was the prime reason that, they started looking at India. And of course, India was ready with its own incentives under the PLI scheme to make it more easier for the company to come in to start production here. So, that's point number one. Apple has been looking at India and expanding in India slowly and gradually over the last half a decade almost now, right? And, also when the assembly base grows, it's very natural, right? Because Apple's assembly base is just very high at this point in time in India. And it's quite substantial. It accounts for about 15 to 20%. So it's quite substantial. It's not a number that they can easily ignore. So when the assembly base grows to a certain critical mass, suppliers automatically, kind of migrate to that particular geography because that just makes the most amount of business sense for them, right? And, the way that I look at this thing is that this is part of that gradual movement. Tariffs or no tariffs, Trump or no Trump, this movement is inevitable because Apple has this sizable and important assembly base in the country. Their suppliers are bound to move to India. That's how China grew and that's how India is expected to grow. But of course, Trump being Trump, he probably didn't take that quite well. And I'm sure what many would look at as a threat, his threat was coming, the 25% tariff on Apple. That threat, I'm sure he was also responding to this development as part of that.
And next we shift our focus to the northeast, where protests are erupting over a new hydropower project. In Arunachal Pradesh Siang district, local opposition to the proposed 11,000 megawatt Upper Siang hydropower project has flared up again after central paramilitary forces and heavy drilling machines arrived at the site. The project, first proposed in 2017, is considered strategically important for India, but has faced strong resistance from locals and 3 anti-dam groups: the Siang Indigenous Farmers Forum, Debang Resistance, and the Northeast Human Rights. This is particularly because activists from the region argue that neither the local population nor village heads were consulted prior to the deployment of security forces or equipment. In fact, in response, residents have launched an indefinite dharna, and tensions rose further when a nearby hanging bridge was reportedly set on fire, cutting off access to the main road. Protesters have now issued a 3-day ultimatum demanding the immediate withdrawal of forces and equipment from the area. To understand the strategic importance of the project and why the locals are against it, my colleague Niharika Nanda had spoken to the Indian Express's Sukrita Baruah last year.
Sukrita, can you begin by telling us what is the Upper Siang storage project?
So the Upper Siang multi-purpose storage project is a proposed hydropower project. It's not been constructed yet. It's proposed to be this 11,000 megawatt hydropower project, which would make it the largest such project in India. And it's proposed to be built on the Siang River, which is in Arunachal Pradesh. Now, the Siang River is the same river which ultimately becomes the Brahmaputra further downstream. So it begins as Sangpo in Tibet and it flows for more than 1,000 kilometers in Tibet. And then the same river enters India from a place called Geling in Arunachal Pradesh. And that's when it becomes the Siang. And then once it flows further down in Assam, this becomes the Brahmaputra. So this is the river on which this project is proposed to be made.
And the project is said to have strategic importance. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So like I said, this river begins in Tibet, flows for a considerable length there, and then enters India. So China is, reported to be working on a number of dams and hydropower projects in the Tibet region. And the largest of this is actually a 60,000 megawatt project. So this Upper Siang project is projected as being a counter to that. So that proposed 60,000 megawatt dam in Tibet is not only supposed to produce a huge amount of hydropower for China, but also it's supposed to be diverting the water of the Sangpo towards North China, which is water scarce. Now, what is feared that will be the consequence of that is that the flow into India will be decreased. So this Upper Siang project is supposed to function as kind of a reservoir. So if the flow decreases, then, it can counter that effect. So that is why this project is projected and touted as one of relevance to national security and as a strategic project.
And Sukrita, can you tell us why is the project facing so much opposition from the locals?
So since its proposal in 2017, the tribe which lives in the area that is likely to be affected by this dam is the majority Adi tribe. The Adi is like the majority tribe in Arunachal Pradesh. And activists and local farmers there have repeatedly been voicing their concern that if this is built, then more than 300 villages will be affected. They will effectively be submerged by this process. And amongst the things that will be affected are actually the district headquarters of Upper Siang, which is Yingkiong. So that is something that, has repeatedly been voiced by activists. They have been resisting. So this dam is supposed to be developed by the NHPC, and efforts have been underway to try and conduct preliminary surveys to get the ball rolling. But those have been stalled for a long time. Those are, taking longer than they would have liked to because of resistance by locals. In fact, presently, the NHPC and the district administrations and the state government are trying to convince the people of the region to allow them to conduct what is called the pre-feasibility survey. Because the NHPC has identified 3 sites in this area, and they intend to carry out pre-feasibility surveys in all 3 of these locations to finalize the final location of the dam. So they're trying to convince the local population to allow them to conduct these surveys, but the people are still resisting it. And along with, say, the question of the way local communities will be affected, they have also been raising the ecological concerns, because Arunachal Pradesh is a biodiversity hotspot. And they've also been saying that, not only will local communities be affected, their way of life will be affected, and the ecology will be affected.
And Sukrita, have similar projects been proposed in the past, and what reaction did they prompt from the locals?
So, see, this particular project, this 11,000 megawatt project, was first proposed in 2017 by the Niti Aayog. But before that also, there has been a number of projects. In fact, this project is supposed to replace 2 projects. There was supposed to be an Upper Siang Stage 1 project and an Upper Siang Stage 2 project, 2 separate dams. And what has been proposed is to integrate both of these in one location. And since the 1980s, there's been a push for dams in Arunachal Pradesh to harness the hydropower potential of the rivers here. And since then, there has been a long history actually of resistance by the local tribal communities there against this kind of dam building. And this particular dam is no exception to that.
You also had the opportunity of talking to the SIFF president. What did he have to say about this?
So he said the same thing that I told you. I had spoken to Gegong Jijong, who's the president of the SIFF. And he is a resident of Gete village, which is also among the villages which will be affected by the dam. And he's been saying that, they've been resisting the dam and that they do not intend to allow any survey to happen, because what he said is that since we don't consent to the dam, why would we consent to a survey? It makes no sense. That's what he was saying. And he was saying that if the dam is built and if, our village is submerged, along with that, our farmlands will be submerged. And his question was, where do we go? He said that if we move further uphill, then there's snow and ice and we won't be able to cultivate there. So our livelihood and our way of living will be completely disrupted. So the same concerns that I mentioned earlier were reiterated by him.
And in the end, we talk about the arrest and rustication of a Pune student over a social media post on Operation Sindoor. The Bombay High Court yesterday criticized the Maharashtra government and Pune's Siang Academy of Engineering for the arrest and rustication of a 19-year-old student following a social media post related to Operation Sindoor. As reported by the Indian Express's Omkar Gokhale, the second-year information technology student was rusticated by the college on 9th of May, the same day an FIR was filed and she was arrested by the Kondwa police. She is currently lodged in Yerwada jail. The student filed a petition seeking to quash her rustication and to be allowed to sit for her semester examinations, which began on 24th of May. During the hearing, the court directed that she be released from custody to appear for her exams. The bench noted that she had already faced consequences, expressed remorse, and deleted the post. Omkar highlights that the college's rustication letter stated that while the institution recognized the right to free expression, it also expected students to exercise such rights responsibly and within the bounds of the law. The college further claimed that the students' actions could undermine its reputation and disturb harmony on campus. In her petition filed through advocate Farhana Shah, the student argued that the college acted arbitrarily without issuing a show cause notice and in violation of her constitutional rights. The bench questioned the proportionality of the college's response and asked why no opportunity for explanation was given. During the hearing, Justice Gauri V. Godse orally remarked to the lawyer representing the institute, quote, "What is this? What kind of conduct is this? Someone expresses something. You want to ruin the life of a student. How can you rusticate like this? Did you call for any explanation? We understand you want to take some action, but you cannot refrain her from appearing for exams. Let her appear for the remaining papers." Unquote. The bench also noted that educational institutions should aim to reform students, not penalize them disproportionately. Omkar notes that the court rejected the suggestion that the student appear for her exams under police escort, stating that she is not a criminal and must be released for the exams. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava, Niharika and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.